Yes.
Yeah, so welcome everybody to the second day of the conference. Yesterday we had a very dynamic and vibrant session. So in that very spirit, we look forward to today's sessions. Over to you, Aditi. Aditi is our rapporteur along with Navanita and Samina Hassan. Professor Samina Hassan is our chair for the session, for the first session. Over to you, Aditi.
Good morning, everybody. Our chair for the session is Professor Samina Hassan Siddiqui. Professor Siddiqui is a professor at the Center for Study of Comparative Religions and Civilizations, Jamia Millia Islamia. She has served as the director of the center. Her areas of interest are socio-religious and cultural study of medieval India with special focus on Sufism. Her publications include Aesthetics of Space, Delhi and the Sufi View, Transcending the Region, Fostering a Regionality, the Sufi Dynamics, Semitic Sacred Imagery, and Social Conformism, Arab and Ajam Experiments. Currently, she is working on deconstructing identities and interplay of region and religion in medieval North India. I would now request Professor Samina Hassan Siddiqui to please take over.
Thank you so much. I would straight away invite Swati Moitra. She's an assistant professor at the Department of English, Gurudas College, University of Calcutta, and she's presenting the first paper. So I request her to go ahead with the paper. Swati Moitra.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible to the audience here. I know that's the first question we ask these days. Without further ado, I'll start my paper, which is titled Padmavati of the Oceans, Syed Alaol's Migrant Epic. In an episode titled Pirates or the Harmads, in Nurunneha and the Tale of the Grave, a ballad from eastern Bengal in the 17th, 18th centuries, pirates terrorized the humble villagers of Rangdia in the Noakhali Chittagong coast of present-day Bangladesh. The fearsome pirates indulge in unscrupulous looting and marauding while the terrified boatmen tremble. Now, not only do they loot and abduct sailors, but they also raid the village. They, in fact, loot houses and they abduct the heroine of the text, Nurunneha. Harma, the term used to refer to Portuguese sailors, is here used interchangeably with pirates or Jolodoshu in the ballad. The ballads from their vantage point in the Noakhali Chittagong coast point to a long history of ties with the neighboring kingdom of Arakan, which controlled the Chittagong port from 1538 to 1666. As Thibaut de Hubert points out, the frontier region between today's Bangladesh and Myanmar is a meeting point of what post-Second World War scholarship defined as South, Southeast and East Asia. It was and remains today a region of intense circulation of people, goods and ideas. This circulation of people was not necessarily free and voluntary movement, as the aforementioned excerpt from the Eastern Bengal ballad shows us. The ballads bear testimony to the long history of Luso-Arakanese piracy and slave trade in the region. This history has left its imprint in the Bengali language, with the phrase Moger Mulluk, literally the land of the mugs, coming to mean a land defined by anarchy and lawlessness, and Harmad becoming synonymous with pirate. The voices of Nurunneha and characters such as her represent the voices of countless unnamed victims of the slave trade in Bengal and adjacent regions, a practice that continued well into the 19th century in different forms. Syed Alaol, the best-known Bengali poet of the Morocco period in Arakan, had a fateful encounter with the Harmads in a manner not unlike the boatmen here. Alaol, who was the son of a dignitary at the court of Majlis Qutub, the Afghan leader of Fatehabad in present-day Bangladesh, did not migrate to Arakan by choice. He writes of the same in his Padmavati. Destiny struck as we traveled on work. We encountered a Harmat ship. After much warfare, my father was martyred. I was brought here from the battlefield. It pains to speak of my history now. I was brought to Rosanga and became a horseman here. So unlike Nurunneha, who in fact escapes, or the unnamed captives who did go on to serve in the fields of Arakan, Tripura, Java, or the Cape Colony, Alaol became a royal slave or a Mankaiwan. After his learning and his artistic abilities came to the attention of his first patron, the powerful Lashkar Wazir, Magan Thakur, also a Bengali Muslim, Alaol would experience a rise in fortune and recognition as a poet. So, this paper seeks to read Padmavati as a narrative of these troubled waters where the sea is wide and dangerous, and marauders can be found waiting for unsuspecting travelers at every bend. The Queen of Padmini, imagined in the harsh tones of the desert and the flames of funeral pyres, is seldom envisioned in contemporary imagination as a narrative of high seas and turbulent waters. Even a prominent shipwreck episode in the original Padmavat has done little to transform such readings of the tale, and the most recent cinematic adaptation does away with the events of the shipwreck altogether. But like the humble Eastern Bengal ballads, suffused with the scent of the salt and the sea, Alaol's Padmavati offers insights into a period of intense and unfree circulation of people in the Bay of Bengal region. The so-called Golden Age of Arakan saw an assertive Arakan in control of the Chittagong port. The high-ranked Bengali Muslims who patronized Daulat Kaji, Alaol's predecessor, and Alaol himself were the main intermediaries between the local authorities and merchants from abroad. Even those who held other non-trading positions nonetheless were involved in this world of long-distance trade over the Bay of Bengal. Dutch records show that Ashraf Khan, the Lashkar Wazir of at a time when Daulat Qazi was writing, had obtained a monopoly on the lucrative rice trade. The emergence of Bengali literature in Arakan was directly tied to the prosperity of this community. Even as the Arakanese kings claimed their Buddhist identity, the prosperous Bengali Muslims patronized literary production in Bengali. There were, of course, other Bengali Muslims in Arakan, less fortunate than Alaol's patrons. The work of Sanjay Subramaniam, Marcus Wink, Stephen Van Galen, and Michael Charney have highlighted various aspects of the Arakan slave trade, as well as the settlements of Bengali Muslims there. The royal subjects of the Mankaivan were bound to the king and had to accomplish chores and services or pay a set of money, which was called Rajdai in Bangla, to free themselves temporarily from these duties. Alaol writes of paying the royal obligation in the Sikandar Nama, his final poem, suggesting that he remained a royal servant or a royal slave till the end of his life. This phrase, bound to the king, demands consideration, suggesting a degree of unfreedom that Alaol continued to experience till the end of his literary career. Keeping in mind the conditions of unfreedom that defined both his arrival as well as his life and literary career, I would like to argue that the scholarly dispute on the emigre nature of Alaol's poetry requires further nuance. Alaol in his own writing does not fail to mention the same time and again in his introductions to his life. In the Sikandar Nama, the previous tale of the Harmads is reiterated, and they are now given the added adjective wicked. Destiny writes our paths, and mine took me to the wicked Harmads. After much warfare, my father was martyred. My sins took me from the battleground to Rosanga. The violence and trauma of these circumstances were significant to Alaol's telling of his own story. And as the Sikandar Nama introduction makes clear, his rise in fortune was contingent on the relationship of the Bengali Muslim nobility with their Buddhist king. When this came under strain with the arrival of the Shah Shuja in 1660, Alaol's fortune saw a reversal. He ended up in prison, and the fact that Alaol chooses to recount this very dark episode in Sikandar Nama, composed a decade after that, suggests an acute awareness of the fickle nature of his fortunes there. So even if his literary cultural milieu and training in Fatehabad ensured that he remained culturally at home in Arakan, his unfree and uncertain existence places him as a figure who straddles both worlds. One of these worlds belonged to his patrons, and the other world belonged to the Bengalis captured in the Luso-Arakanese raids or forcibly deported from Chittagong as per the king's authors. To those who were declared dead or on arrival or soon after, Katsi disease and malnutrition, to those sold to the Dutch VOC and transported to Batavia and beyond, to those who escaped, to those bound to the king, obligated to perform tasks or to pay a royal duty. And what do such considerations of unfreedom mean for the study of Alaol's poetry? What reading strategies can we adopt for his body of work, keeping in mind his straddling of the both worlds of the Bengali Muslims in Arakan? Let us consider the tale of the capture of the parrot Hiramani. Like in Jayasi's poem, the parrot's voice becomes the voice of the author in Padmavati. The parrot, after his capture, tells other birds, "Listen, my fellow birds, there is no escaping the suffering fortune writes for you. Even if someone is a pandit or a master of the scriptures, they cannot comprehend the wishes of destiny. Like the parrot that cites the stroke of destiny, Vidhi, to come to terms with its capture, Alaol mentions destiny as the agent of his capture by the Harmads time and again in the telling of his own story. The parrot's words of wisdom, wiping its own tears, mirrors that of the poet, for whom patience and submission to divine will alone can lessen the suffering mandated by destiny. The parrot goes on to become Ratan Sen's guru, and it's also the trajectory of the poet who manages to gain entry into the inner circles of the Bengali Muslim nobility of Arakan, Katsi Magan Thakur. This entry is not without uncertainty, as as the parrot cautions. It is only steadfastness towards God, who sees all, and towards the patron that can offer a semblance of security to the Manki one. And it is not simply the tale of the parrot that speaks of the uncertainties of the Manki one. For all that he is at home culturally among the Bengali Muslims of Arakan, he locates himself as an accidental resident at the very onset. Elsewhere, the naval might of the Arakan king gets special mention as something that has no comparison anywhere else in the world. The catalogue of the ships links Arakan's might with its naval might, and in the process reminds us of the other side of the story, of the utter defenselessness of the populations of Lower Bengal in the face of the slave raids of such a great naval power. In other episodes, the perils of migration, especially by the sea, takes on a place of significance even within the framework of Jayasi's poem that Alaol mostly replicates. The voyage of Ratan Sen to Sinhala and his return to Chittor is of interest here. Now, Jayasi's Ratan Sen crosses the mythical seven seas, his journey a spiritual journey, as well. Alaol's Ratan Sen makes the same journey. But the voyage, however, is far more mundane, merely comprising of large fish and birds of prey. And it is curious that a poet as well versed in Sufi doctrine as Alaol refrains from following Jayasi's footsteps. It is almost as though he can imagine no sea voyage but a prosaic one that foregrounds the voices of ordinary boatmen alongside that of the king. On their journey back, Alaol stays faithful to Jayasi's structure yet again. The shipwreck is described in graphic terms, and Alaol's descriptions here are close to that of the ballads of Eastern Bengal. His audience, comprising of Bengali Muslims involved in the long-distance sea trade, would be all too familiar with such images. The seas that carried Ratan Sen to Sinhala, to his beloved, can also take her away. The seas, he seems to be suggesting, that bring prosperity to the merchants can also take it away in a moment of uncertainty. The seas that make Arakan the golden land can also bear the Magh and Harmat ships to the shores of Bengal, leading to the death of loved ones, such as Alaol's father, and to the destruction and enslavement of the littoral communities. The ships can bear the enslaved to Arakan or to beyond, to Batavia, to Colombo, to the Cape Colony. Padmini's farewell to her companions and parents in this episode has been commented upon frequently by Bengali scholars for its realist representation. Now, Alaol does indeed draw upon familiar tropes. Padmini blames her destiny for her departure from Sinhala, and the metaphor of exile plays out throughout this episode in a manner not unlike the Bijaya songs lamenting Uma's departure from her parental home. The capricious Bidhi or destiny that led to the parrot's capture and to Alaol's encounter with the Harmads also leads to Padmini's departure from her parental home. Padmini is allowed an extended farewell, departing with the knowledge that her parents and companions are safe at home in Sinhala. For captives of the slave raids, such farewells could only be a figment of one's imagination. The safety of their loved ones, as Alaol would know from his father's murder in the hands of the Harmad, often wishful thinking. If uncertainty and the perils of migration mark the text of Padmavati, then so does the question of belonging. Alaol's muluk, as he tells us, mulk, it was Fatehabad. Now, curiously, the elaborate descriptions of Arakan and the praises of the king somehow do not merit the use of the word mulk or desh with reference to Arakan. On the contrary, he speaks of belonging with reference to the many, many Muslims who reside there, who welcome him and appreciate his learning. Unlike Daulat Kaji, he makes no mention of Hindus in these gatherings. And while the golden city and its king garners effusive praise, it is Magan Thakur who offers him shelter and patronage. This, the poet states, is something Magan Thakur does frequently to Muslims of different ethnic origins. He calls them Pardesi or foreigners. Magan, in fact, offers shelter to even those who offend the king,
Just
suggesting
reminding you 5 minutes.
Suggesting a parallel authority. The Sikandar Nama, written some 25 years later, describes the gathering at the secondary court of his then patron, the Majlis Navaraja. Alaol sings paeans to the free-flowing cultural landscape of the court. Now, belonging in Arakan for him is marked by unfreedom. The patron's gatherings, on the other hand, make it possible to forge bonds of kinship that exist outside of familial ethnic ties. The bonds of kinship that were forged in these gatherings has to be understood as bonds that were actively made through a combination of their shared adab and the experience of eating together and appreciating the heterogeneous sense of the gathering. It was made possible through the shared experience of art. So the Padmavati, his first presentation, has to be understood in this context. The conclusion of the Padmavati, with its divergence from the Jayasi poem, might thus be understood as an expression of belonging. A dying Ratan Sen requests that his sons be taken to the Sultan of Delhi. A repentant Khalji weeps for Ratan Sen, avenges him by killing Devpal, and becomes the guardian. He visits Chittor and walks freely in the streets, awed by its sight. This vision of reconciliation offered by the Padmavati is a form of reconciliation made possible under the grand umbrella of Islam, where the aggressor can come to lament his actions and experience a moment of respect for his vanquished opponent, a non-believer. This utopic vision of reconciliation is furthermore Alaol laying claim to his Persianate self from the fringes of the Muslim world. The mutual respect imagined between the victor and the vanquished in the Padmavati is one that is impossible in Arakan between the king and his royal slave. The vision of Padmavati's conclusion is less a statement of affirmation for Arakan or its territorial sovereignty against the mighty Mughals, as Ramya Srinivasan has argued, and more an affirmation of the ties forged through shared culture and the shared experience of art. It is an ambitious affirmation of belonging in the wider Persianate world, of claiming that world from the margins and rendering it anew as a wider, more just world. And this is my conclusion, so I think I'm on time. Now, I find it very telling that even the most recent adaptation of the Padmavat recognizes the migrant story that is at the heart of Queen Padmini's tale. The filmmaker, not known for subtlety in his aesthetics, places Queen Padmini in contrast with Khalji, one a migrant from the exotic land of Sinhala depicted in shades of bright green, and the other a savage Turk from the badlands of Central Asia, painted in shades of grey and black. The good migrant, bad migrant binary that plays out in such an interpretation of the story, where the queen's immersion into her husband's Rajput culture transforms her speech and appearance, even as the bad sultan stands out as the defiant, unassimilated other. Her physical annihilation through the act of Jauhar marks her spiritual triumph, even as the Sultan is unable to enter beyond the doorsteps in a scene that is sort of reminiscent very poorly of the end of Mirch Masala. But there is no such binary in Alaol's narrative of Queen Padmini. On the contrary, his 17th century interpretation of the Padmavat speaks, on one hand, of the agony of captivity and the uncertainties of a bound existence. On the other hand, it imagines the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation, of a world generous enough for the vanquisher to weep for the vanquished, and of a world wide enough to accommodate the vanquished king's sons with their dignity and honor intact. And that's all I have to say for now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Swati. It was so interesting. I just wanted to hear more of it, but since we are time, I would open this to question, and I think the rapporteur can take over from here. We have 10 minutes.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right. Thank you for that wonderful paper. There was a point where you mentioned about the Bengali Muslims patronizing literature in Bangla. So, I would like to hear more about what was the larger impact of these slave trades on the production of literature as such and the circulation of such literature concerning the readership or the people who were publishing, etc., later or whenever that came into being. Could you
Right.
please enlighten me on that
Yes,
subject?
yes. No, now our knowledge of the Bengali literature produced in Arakan is sadly very limited, and this is largely because of the fact that the works of two poets, Daulat Qazi and Syed Alaol, have survived. And furthermore, Magan Thakur, whom I also mentioned in the paper, he is also said to have written one unfinished poem. Now, the works of both these poets at least was centered in Arakan among the rich Bengali Muslims, and the circulation of their work was somewhat limited and related to and tied to this very specific court atmosphere, well, secondary court atmosphere of the Bengali Muslims who were considerably rich and privileged at that point of time. Their proliferation among the ordinary Bengali Muslims is something that still remains in question. We have very little traces of it. Thibaut de Hubert, in his recent work, has in fact traced some of it to Bhulua, which was, of course, which is Noakhali today, where and in Chittagong, where he has traced artists and scholars who at least were somewhat familiar with the work of Alaol. And as we have found that Alaol's work in the 18th and the 19th century continued to proliferate in the a countryside in eastern Bengal. It was published in Bortola later. But as for the true impact of this is something that we are left to speculate upon, largely because the literary landscape of Bengali Muslims in eastern Bengal is primarily a community of people who are not necessarily or not necessarily lettered as such. We can make some guesses, say from the eastern Bengali ballads that I referred to, or the Moymonsingo Gitika. These texts do give us some impression of proliferation and exchanges, but it's very difficult to tell as to how far the ambitious work of Alaol, writing in the court of somebody as influential as Magan Thakur, really managed to proliferate even among the most immediate surroundings, that is to say, namely Chittagong and the areas around. So we can only make some guesses about it. And as regards to the slave trade itself, the Bengal slave trade, the work has only started now. There is a considerable work that scholars have pieced together in South Africa, for example. But again, the problem here becomes is that it becomes very difficult for us to, at least so far it has been very difficult to trace as to what they may have been familiar with in terms of, because the slave records are so few and far between. One only hears of names. I don't know if the archives can open up to more, but so far there is very little information available. But I know that there is considerable work going on in this area. I
Right,
hope,
right.
yeah.
Right. I have a comment here from Professor Dilip Menon. He's writing excellent paper freeing Bengal from the landed imagination created by permanent settlement and bringing the ocean back in, moving away from thalassoamnesia. As Sunil Amrit's book reminds us, the Bay of Bengal opened up Bengal eastwards to Burma and Southeast Asia and westwards to the Cape at the tip of South Africa, thinking also with mobile bodies like that of slave and pirate. The parrot's voice remarks on destiny, but also on the turbulent nature of lives, territories, and religious identities. Ideas of Bithi or destiny are historical and located in particular time zones. Van Schendel's idea of Zomia too may be useful here as space of constant reconstitution at borders of states or empires.
Absolutely.
There's a comment.
These are
You may.
just comments.
Yes,
It's
yes. Very well taken. Thank you so much for it.
Do we have any other questions?
Yes, we have one more question in the chat box.
Yes, we have a question from Isan ul Sham to everybody. He says that could you please elaborate on a linguistic perspective of Alaol's literary world, that a combination of Bengali, Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic, and the vast cosmological imagination of Bengali Muslims as Alaol's Saif al-Muluk and Badi's Jamal depicts.
Right. With regards to his literary world, absolutely. Now, this is a poet who is very well versed in the traditions of Persian and Arabic, Arabic learning, and of course, his privileged upbringing in the court of Majlis Kutub allows him that. Furthermore, he is also, it's not simply Bengali and Sanskrit he's well versed in, he's also versed in Brajbuli and Maithili, because there is considerable familiarity with the work. If you look at the Bengali structurings of his, especially in early poems like Padmavati, he's somebody very well familiar with the works of Vidyapati. The clear impact, and some of the padas are in fact almost direct, I wouldn't say copy, but direct translations of Vidyapati in various places. So yes, this is a very heterogeneous literary world that he inhabits, and he inhabits this without much self-consciousness, at least in an early text like Padmavati. Later he becomes a little more circumspect about using Sanskrit metaphors, but that also has its specific place. So, but in this, Alaol is not alone. um, if Ramya Srinivasan's work alone on the Padmini narratives has shown this, that Alaol, much like his contemporaries in other parts of mainland India, though Alaol is very far removed from the world there, Alaol is immersed in that heterogeneous literary cultural training where it is not unsurprising for a man of his learning to be trained in Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic at the same time, but rather expected. So, that literary world is something that is reflected very much in his poetry. And furthermore, he is truly ambitious enough in his poems to attempt to mold Bengali poetics in a certain manner. As regards to the cosmological imagination of the Bengali Muslims, yes, of course, again, Alaol is drawing upon, but Alaol's uh, thought is very distinctly drawing upon the Sufi thought of his particular, I mean, his training. He changes after, he changes from the Chishtiya order to another order later on, but that is something that is reflected here. But that said, I would be very hesitant to locate Alaol very decisively among the cosmological imagination of the ordinary Bengali Muslims, precisely because of Alaol's removal from that particular world in terms of his learning. He is not I mean, he is not an average resident of Chittagong. He is from a Indo-Afghan background, and that locates him, that places him in his early training among the ruling classes as opposed to the native converted Muslims of Bengal. That is something, that is a distinction that we do need to take into account, I think. I'm not sure if that answers your question very well, but I hope it does. We can talk about it later some more.
Thank you. I have another question here
Mm.
from Manola Gayatri. She's writing, would you like to elaborate on the reconciliation and space of the cultural sphere, and maybe perhaps as a fluid space?
Yes, the reconciliation is something that is the most striking aspect of the Padmavati, because it directly moves away not only from Jayasi's narrative, but also from any other interpretation of the Padmavat that I have encountered. Though, of course, there are many that I may not have. And that this reconciliation is something that is very distinctly unusual, to a point where, Srinivasan, for instance, has argued that this is an anti-Mughal narrative. But I have found no reason for Alaol to be particularly, nationalistic, for the lack of a better word, towards Arakan. And it makes more sense to imagine this reconciliation as one that imagines Islam as something generous enough for the vanquisher and the vanquished, the believer and the non-believer, to have a space where it's possible for even opponents like Ratan Sen and Khalji to, in fact, come to a place of mutual understanding. That's what makes it possible. So that is the element of reconciliation that I find particularly striking in the Padmavati. And the space of the cultural sphere, well, of course,
One minute.
yeah.
1 minute. Only just 1 minute.
Right. So, with regards to the space of the cultural sphere, well, I was talking to the larger Indo-Afghan literary world with the shared culture of Sanskrit, of Persian and Arabic that makes possible for Alaol. Now, this is something I had to leave out of the paper, but Arakan was understood in deeply racialized terms. It's not only in the fringes of the Muslim world, literally in the frontiers. It's also Jahangir himself calls it a place full of people who eat horrible food and human and God knows what. So this racialized imagination is precisely something that Alaol is doing away with it in claiming himself a part of that same cultural sphere as the mighty Mughals elsewhere.
Thank you, Swati. I'll have to stop you there because we
Yeah,
will now have to move on to the next speaker.
right.
Yeah. Thank you, Swati. That was very insightful. Now I would invite Mohammed Shameem.
Actually,
Yeah.
ma'am, I would like to interrupt. Mohammed Shameed is unavailable due to technical issues. So we move to the third speaker, Sushmita Banerjee.
All right, let's invite Sushmita Banerjee. She's an assistant professor at Miranda House, University of Delhi. So I would request her to present her paper and keep the time 20 minutes. All right.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So the title of my paper is A Theologian as Public Intellectual, al-Haqq Muhaddis Dehlawi in 16th century India. When we study the early modern South Asia, that is the 16th, if you're looking at, I'm focusing on the 16th and the 17th century. There are a range of changes that were taking place in the political culture, in intellectual sphere, in terms of circulation of ideas and norms of governance. And historians are increasingly engaging with the nature of literary circulation, the role of scribal class in the formation of societies. Largely, if we look at North India in the late 16th and early 17th century, the effect of the Mughal state in impacting the intellectual discourse has been a sphere of study for a large number of scholars. So the Mughal norms of governance, which were influenced by Nasirian ethics, akhlaq traditions, sulh-e-kul, have been dealt with in great depth by a range of scholars. Particularly the way in which Abul Fazl's ideas were influenced by the philosophy of Nasiruddin Tusi, the circulation of ideas relating to justice, equity, equipoise. These have been part of the larger intellectual discourse of the early modern period. But as it is apparent in the writings of scholars in the recent years, the idea of sulh-e-kul, which is often regarded as an idea which originated from the Mughal court, was actually not restricted to the Mughal court. As Muzaffar Alam has pointed out, the idea resonated in Sufi texts, particularly Abdul Rahman Chishti. Also, 16th century was marked by the growth of millenarian ideas in various parts of the Islamic world. And in South Asia, the efforts were made by sovereigns to combine political and spiritual power. So the focus has, to a large extent, has been on the Mughal state. But in the recent years, scholars are also looking at the forces outside the Mughal state. So what was the role of the Sufis or the scribes, and how did they contribute to the intellectual history of early modern South Asia? The kind of text that they transcribed on norms of governance, on mysticism. So Chandraban Brahman's writings, which Rajiv Kendra has looked at in the mid 17th century, is a case in point. So in this paper, I want to focus on the writings of a scholar, al-Haqq Muhaddis Dehlawi, who died in 1642. And he was a contemporary of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. So I want to look at, he wrote a lot. He wrote around 48 texts, but I want to focus on his efforts in bringing about ideas that were circulating in the Islamic world to South Asia. So I in particular, I want to focus on his travel to the Hijaz and the kind of ideas that he gained from his stay in Hijaz for 3 years, and the vision that he developed during his stay in Hijaz. So I want to study. He was a scholar. He was a Sufi. He was affiliated to the Qadri Sufi order. He was a scholar, and he gained a renown as a Muhaddis, as a scholar of Hadith. So I want to look at his writings as and trace his role as a public intellectual, because his writings were of diverse kinds and they were multifaceted. So I want to see how he tried to shape the discourse of being an ideal Muslim in his writings. Abdul-Haqq was based in Delhi, and he initially received training in Quran under his father and classical Persian text. Subsequently, he was initiated to the Qadri Sufi order by Sheikh Musa. He also spent some time in Fatehpur Sikri, but he was never officially associated with the Mughal court. He traveled to the Hijaz in 1589, and he stayed there for 3 years. And then he received training in Hadith and Sufism during his stay there. And then he came back and became a teacher in his father's madrasa. And he started writing a lot. He actually started writing from the 1580s, before he made this journey to the Hijaz. And after he came back from the Hijaz, he started producing large number of texts, both in Persian as well as Arabic. His posthumous fame is largely in as a Muhaddis. So there have been a lot of biographies about, or short biographies about regarding him in the 18th, 19th century, also in the 17th century, which talk about his contribution to the sphere of Hadith. But his writings were not restricted to Hadith in the late 16th and early 17th century. So he wrote Tazkirats, he wrote Sufi Tazkirats before he left for Hijaz, but he completed it after he came back. He wrote at least two of them. One is called the Akhbar al-Akhir, which is much cited, and the other is Zadul Muttaqin, which I'll talk about in today's paper. And then he wrote several commentaries on Hadith in Arabic as well as Persian. He also wrote a political chronicle. He wrote a text on ethics, which was apparently dedicated to Jahangir. He wrote large number of letters to Mughal courtiers. He wrote letters to the Sufis. So his contribution was much wider than just writing commentaries on the Hadith. In the modern historiography, he's often just regarded as a Muhaddis. So his contribution to vast spheres of knowledge is largely neglected. So I want to look at his, how the travel to the Hijaz impacted his writings, impacted his thought process. But before I move into that, I would just wanted to make a few points regarding transoceanic travels in the period before the 16th century. So when scholars like A. Nizami have looked at Abdul-Haqq, he said that there was the Hadith learning had almost was hardly there in the Indian subcontinent. So it was because of Abdul-Haqq that Hadith learning again gained importance in the Indian subcontinent in the late 16th and most importantly in the 17th century. But Abdul-Haqq himself states in the Akhbar al-Akhir that there were several people who traveled to the Hijaz to get training in the 15th century, in the early 16th century. So Mia Muhammad Tahir from Gujarat, for instance, traveled to the Mecca and he received training in Hadith, and he came back to India and then he wrote books on Ilm Hadith. Sheikh Abdul Allah, he traveled from Medina, settled in India, and then he started teaching Hadith. In addition to that, what we also see happening is there were some people who started writing in text in the way in which Arabic texts were being written in the Indian subcontinent, and they learned this style during their stay in the Hijaz. So Haji Dabir was based in Gujarat. He traveled to the Mecca. He established certain connections there, and when he came back to India, he wrote a history of the Gujarat Sultanate and other regional sultanates, and he got a patronage for account of that. Similarly, Ibn Shakham, another person, he also produced biographical writings in the late 16th century Deccan, drawing upon Arabic texts. So there was already there were these precedents which were there, where people were traveling and producing biographical texts where they were talking about other scholars or poets who had traveled and who had popularity across regions. So it seems Abdul-Haqq was trying to follow this kind of a trend, although it was not widespread, but there were some people who were engaging in this kind of travel and production of biographical dictionaries, which included biographies of people across regions. So to briefly tell you about Abdul-Haq's travel to the Hijaz, he left in 1589, and he says that he had this strong desire to, and had restlessness to gain knowledge. That's why he decided to leave. But he actually talks a great deal about his journey within the Indian subcontinent before he left for the Hijaz. So he stopped at Ujjain. He got support from Mirza Aziz Koka, who was an influential Mughal courtier. Then he met Muhammad Ghaus Shattari, who was an important Sufi who also produced a Tazkira. And then he stayed for 1 year because the sailing season was over. And during this time, he met Sheikh Wajiuddin Alawi, who was a Qadri Sufi. And he didn't become his disciple, but his thoughts influenced him. Scott Cawthon has talked about this. And after that, he finally left for the Hijaz. Now, his journey to the Hijaz and the people under whom he received training is documented by him in his Tazkirat, in a Sufi biographical dictionary called Zadul Muttaqin. So this text contains biographies of two Sufis, Abdul Wahab Muttaqi, who was Abdul-Haq's teacher in the Hijaz, and Ali Muttaqi, who was Abdul Wahab's teacher, as well as a few other Sufis and scholars who were based in Mecca. So it is interesting that Abdul Wahab Muttaqi was of South Asian descent. He had migrated to Mecca in 1555, and then he settled there and became a teacher. His teacher Ali Muttaqi had been initiated into several Sufi orders like Qadri, Shazli, Madini, Chishti, and he was a teacher of Hadith and Aqwal of Prophet, and also had compiled a digest of Jalaluddin Suyuti's book. Abdul-Haqq mentioned all this in his Zadul Muttaqi, and he also states that Abdul Wahab Muttaqi, his teacher, was unequivocal in ulum shariat and had expertise in fiqh, hadith, philosophy, and was also initiated in multiple Sufi silsilas, just like his teacher Ali Muttaqi. So Abdul Wahab argued that Abdul-Haqq should get training in zikr, and zikr included not just reciting the name of God, but also reading namaz, doing tilawat, or reading of Quran, reading about ulum shariat. So his Abdul-Haq's core training was in Mishkat al-Mashabi, the Hadith collection. But along with that, he also read the Rasail, or the letters of Sufis relating to Ahkam Tariqat and Adab Suluk. And in addition, he read the works of Sheikh Ahmad Zarruq and Sheikh Ataullah Iskandari. Abdul-Haqq interacted with various other scholars and Sufis who were based in Medina. And although he wanted to read other Hadith texts, but Abdul Wahab advised him to focus on Zikr Ilahi and Khilwat. So Abdul Wahab gradually oriented Abdul-Haqq towards Sufism, and he fused his pursuit of religious knowledge with Sufism by inculcating internal discipline of self-alienation, asceticism, so that outer scholarly effort was fused with inner devotion. And after having received this training for 3 years, then Abdul-Haqq came back to Delhi. But Abdul-Haqq talked about this in great detail, about his journey, about his teachers in Zadul Muttaqin, as well as in the Akhbarul Akhyar. The Akhbarul Akhyar became extremely popular text. And it helped, and this writing of this text, Zadul Muttaqin, it enabled him to popularize these Sufis, the Muttaqi Sufis, as well as other Sufis, and their tariqa in South Asia. And by placing himself as an acclaimed murid of these Sufis, he could build a reputation for himself. So in addition, the training that Abdul-Haqq received in Hadith enabled him to compose several commentaries on Hadith in Persian as well as Arabic in the early 17th century. He produced voluminous texts on Hadith as well as short texts, and some of these have survived, some haven't. But his Persian commentary on Mishkat al-Mashabi is quite popular. So is his Arabic commentary. But his training in Hadith didn't restrict him to just produce commentaries on Hadith, because he had imbibed this knowledge. so well. So he wrote letters to his contemporaries, which had citations from hadith from the life of Prophet, explanations about verses of the Quran and hadith, and various other themes like Sama, Wahdatul Wajud, and all this he discussed in his letters to Sufis, to scholars, and to Mughal courtiers. So what I'm arguing is Abdul Haq's training equipped him with knowledge that was prevalent in the Arab world. Uh, not just like some of his contemporary scholars of Arabic, Abdul Haqq produced biographies that sought to unwrap the lives of the Buzurg in Mecca and discussed life of South Asian Sufis who had settled in Mecca and detailed his journey and experiences. The two texts that Abdul Haqq wrote, I don't have time to talk about the other one.
You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I'll just conclude. So it helped him to situate his thought process within the medieval Islamic world. So Abdul Haq's journey to Mecca, it shaped his social network as it did in case of various other people, and it facilitated in enhancing his intellectual connections and spiritual knowledge. Abdul Haq reported similar stories about his preceptor Abdul Wahab Muttaqi and his teacher as he did in his own case, that is his journey, that the places where Ali Muttaqi stayed in Gujarat, the time, what was his approach towards zikr, about offering namaz, about disassociating from meeting from people, dispensing cash donations, and the fact that Ali Muttaqi had received spiritual affiliation in multiple Sufi orders. Abdul Haq also was affiliated to multiple Sufi orders, and he mentioned about several such people in his Tazkirats. And and Ali Muttaqi's task of guiding people regarding Sharia and Tariqa. Similarly, with regards to Abdul Wahab Muttaqi, there is a discussion about his travels within India, how he stayed in Gujarat, and the conditions under which he lived in Mecca, his attitude towards Sama, Tasawwuf, Adab, Zikr, his approach towards students, about Futu, and among other topics. And various other short biographies that Abdul Haq included in the Zadul Muttaqin also talked about some similar ideas about these Sufis. So Abdul Haq intended to showcase the brilliant stature of South Asian Sufis among scholars and Sufis who had settled in Mecca. And though Zadul Muttaqin was written in Persian, it utilized some of the styles prevalent in the Arab world in reporting biographies of Muslims who had transoceanic presence. Abdul Haq's literary and life history and writing sought to capture his transoceanic appeal by reporting a wide range of biographies in his texts that spanned across different regions of Indian subcontinent, as well as those who had migrated to Mecca and settled there. In addition, Abdul Haq also attempted to incorporate Arabo-Persian styles of writing that was not restricted to biographical mode of writing. So this was visible in his choice of themes. So while discussing, for instance, Ibn al-Arabi's book, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which is often regarded as a controversial text on account of its approach towards matters relating to acceptance of faith at the time of death, Abdul Haq cited the authority of Abdul Wahab. He did not discredit the text, but he said that the text has fawaid or morals which are beneficial, provided one doesn't get swayed away by its tone or content. Similarly, regarding a text, Insan-e-Kamil, Abdul Haq reported an incident by Abdul Wahab that the author had mentioned that one should not draw conclusion about the text without reading it. Several great Sufis had talked about it, but Abdul Wahab refrained from criticizing the text and said it was important to discuss the contents of the text. So Abdul Wahab, inculcated this training that you should be careful about text and also discourse about both Sufism and Sharia. Similarly, there are, but I don't have much time. So he similarly about Fakhr Muhammad. Yeah,
2 minutes.
Yeah. So I'll just conclude. So he similarly he talked about Fakhr Muhammadi and various other ideas. So whatever he had learned during his training in Hijaz, he started talking about it in his various writings, in his letters, in Sufi biographies, in various other kinds of texts. His writing or his thought process was not restricted to the Hadith genre. So I feel it is pertinent to see how Abdul-Haqq sought to utilize his training in the Hijaz after his return to India. Abdul-Haqq wrote large number of letters to his contemporaries, and he reiterated the need to follow Sufi masters' advice along with adherence to the Sharia, which Abdul Wahab had recommended. There was a range of perceptions about Insan-e-Kamil in the political discourse of Mughals, but Abdul-Haqq argued that there is a need to have a complete understanding of these ideas rather than a superficial understanding. Most of the times when scholars study the intellectual milieu of early modern period, they focus on spread of rational ideas, messianic ideas, role of state in disseminating these ideas. Even when scholars focus on discourse outside the courtly circles, the focus is on liberal-minded Chishti Sufis who sought to Indianize Islam by interpreting the usage of Sharia and Sufism in a novel manner. Muhaddis is rarely studied for his liberal approach. Often orthodoxy and conservatism are regarded as the benchmark of a textually oriented scholar. But in this paper, I'm trying to indicate that how a textually oriented scholar like Abdul-Haqq used the time that he had spent in the Hijaz to understand rational systems of thought that were inherent in Islam. He refrained from unnecessary criticism of texts and perspectives that he did not subscribe to. However, there was adequate opportunity to adhere to Sharia, Sufism, and disseminate Arabic forms of knowledge in the Persian world of the subcontinent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting and full of details. Can we go ahead with the questions?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Sushmita. That was indeed a very great paper. We have a question from Professor Dilip Menon sir. He asks, could you tell us more about your relation to the emerging work on Indian Ocean, Islam, Green, Race, Korea? What role did the ocean play in his writing? Is there an engagement with the sea as such in his travel to Hejaz? Or is the sea merely the space through which he travels? How does your paper relate to the idea of oceanic cosmopolitanism? It's very hermetic and textualist, as also landed in quotes at present, perhaps. Your response to it, Sushmita?
If I look at the Zadul Muttaqin, he doesn't really talk about his sea journey. And in the other text, which is about Medina, he doesn't talk about the sea as such, but he talks about his journey in Medina. Yes, it is largely about his travel within land that he talks about in his writings. But what I'm trying to say is, how this travel actually impacted his thought process and his style of writing. Because most of the times when we think of Hijaz, we are largely thinking in terms of the fact that people go there for Hajj, and in his case, he also did go for the Hajj, but he also acquired training in Hadith, and it is largely restricted that if he is a Muhaddis, the only thing that he could talk about is Hadith. But and what I'm trying to see is there were various other knowledge systems that were prevalent. There were various other scholars who were writing about a range of ideas in Medina. So Abdul-Haqq tried to bring those ideas into circulation in the Indian subcontinent. So his travel helped him to bring those ideas. But I have not really encountered any description about his journey through the sea in his in Zadul Muttaqin. I will also look at his other text on Jazbul Qulub, but I'll see if there is any reference to it. But as of now, I haven't found any reference to it.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that paper, Sushmita. I had a question. Could you please enlighten us if there were any other translations of Abdul-Haq's work, or because he was traveling from one place to another, I mean, were there any other cultures apart from the Islamic culture, I mean, or religions which influenced his work or writings, or I mean, not just for Abdul-Haqq, but for other Sufi writers as well?
See, Abdul-Haqq is not influenced. I don't think he's influenced by any other religion. But it is interesting that his uncle Rizqallah Mustaki, he wrote in Hindavi, and when he wrote in Hindavi, he was drawing upon various kinds of ideas that were there. He wrote in the pen name Rajan. So he was, but his the Hindavi text that he wrote hasn't survived. So Abdul-Haqq is, although there were, if you look at some of the other Sufis or writers, they are influenced sometimes by Krishna Bhakti. So Francesca Orsini has talked about this in her writings. But Abdul-Haqq is trying to stay away from those kinds of ideas. He is trying to look within Islam, and how within Islam there are rational ideas which one should imbibe. I think that's what he's trying to say. But as far as other Sufis are concerned, there are actually many. So if you look at Muzaffar Alam's work on Abdul Rahman Chishti, he has talked about the range of texts that he wrote. So one of them is about the origin of this world, where Shiva is talking about the origin of the world to Parvati. And and if you look at Muzaffar Alam's article, he when Abdul Rahman Chishti is writing about how Shiva is describing the origin of the world to Parvati, there are references to Prophet Muhammad, there are references to Hassan and Hussein. But in the end, the idea that Abdul Rahman Chishti is conveying is, although there are all these Indic knowledge systems that are in place, but Islamic knowledge systems are much more superior. But Abdul-Haqq is refraining from those kinds of writings. He's focusing more on Islam.
We have another question. This is from Nishad Zedi ma'am. She says, she asks, have you looked at other writings related to Indian Ocean Islam? How does Abdul-Haqq's work interact with that?
No, at present I have not looked at any other work on Indian Ocean Islam. This is I've just started working on this, so I haven't looked at other works on Indian Ocean Islam. I will definitely try and look at them, because I was largely focusing on his various texts. This is Zadul Muttaqin I've just started looking at.
Yes, I have, this is my observation. I mean, a sort of an information, if you could just give me. You said that Abd al-Haqq, if I'm pronouncing that right, he wrote letters to certain Mughal courtiers, right? So if you could just probably shed some light on that, it would be really helpful.
Okay. So he wrote letters to various Mughal courtiers like Mirza Aziz Koka. Then he also wrote letters to Khane Khana. But these letters are, he also wrote letters to Murtaza Khan. And in these letters, he's largely talking about conduct, about what an ideal Muslim conduct should be like, that you should read namaz and you should give donations. You should lead in, how you can lead a better life. But when we look at the content, it's not about politics. He is not discussing politics. He's not asking them about their general well-being. So, but what we do, understand from some of these letters is, it seems that he used to probably have hold discourses where people would come and listen to what he was saying, because in some of these letters, Abdul-Haqq is saying that you requested me to summarize what I had said. So here I'm reproducing what I had said earlier. And although I said that these letters are written to Mughal courtiers, but that is what we have from when we look at the lithographed version of the text. We know, we are told, we know that these were written to Mughal courtiers. But when Abdul-Haqq produced a list of his works, he doesn't mention the names of the people to whom these letters were written. So he looked at this compendium of letters more as essays that people should read and derive their and know about ideal Muslim conduct. Or there were also, but the letters that he wrote to the Sufis are much more interesting. So he talks about, for instance, Sama And when he talks about Sama, he engages with a range of ideas, starting from what Prophet had said about music, what was the Chishti Sufi opinion on Sama, what was the Sohrawardi Sufi opinion. And in the end, he doesn't say whether Sama is legal or illegal, but he leaves you with a range of ideas that are there. And some of the other letters that he wrote to the other Sufis, they engage deeply with some of the ideas that I had mentioned about Fakr Muhammadi, about Futuhat al-Makkiyah. So his letters become complex as he engages with a range of people.
I think we have 1 more minute, otherwise we can move to the next speaker.
Do we have any other questions? It doesn't seem that we have any other questions in the chat box.
So let's, who is the next speaker now? Is Mr. Shameem is there or not?
We move to Iqtedar and then we move to Shameem.
All right, let's invite Mr. Iqtedar Alam. He's assistant professor at the Faculty of Architecture and Acoustics, Jamia Millia Islamia. I'll request him to present his paper.
Yes. Good morning. What I'm going to talk on is about mapping the syncretic grammar of the coastal cities and architecture through Ibn Battuta's water journeys in the Indian Ocean. Cities and architecture, if I'm to talk about, so cities and architecture have shown a great propensity to being influenced, inspired through cultural interactions with other regions within or outside their political boundaries. Historically, trade exchanges have engendered multi-directional flow of bodies, capital, power, culture, aesthetics. Many traders across the Indian Ocean often settled in the lands they traded with, and over a period of time were deeply enmeshed in the local politics, culture, and geographies. Among other things, these immigrant settlers became involved with new planning and architectural developments, translating their native grammar onto the local architecture, resulting in a new syncretic style. Settlements along the coastal belt of India are witness to such exchange of design aesthetics on account of their maritime networks with cities in the Arab world as well as those in Southeast Asia. My paper explores the effect of these collateral exchanges on the spatial grammar, structure of space, sense of place, morphologies of concepts, inspirations, influences, and the tradition of form, function, and orientation in the planning and architecture of the cities that are described in the writing of Ibn Battuta's journey in the Indian Ocean. Ibn Battuta was a Moroccan traveler, was appointed by Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the second ruler of the Tughlaq dynasty, as the kingdom's ambassador to China. In his travelogue, he describes what a journey is across the Indian Ocean and the cosmopolitan nature he embarks at, and the fluid grammar of their architecture too, in addition to the climatic, religio-cultural, and economic conditions of the places that he had visited. Through Ibn Battuta's writing, this paper would illustrates the nature of cultural syncretism in these historic cities and the idiom of amalgamation in their architecture. I've used the translated works of Ibn Battuta's travelogues by H.A.R. Gibb and C.F. Beckingham as a key resource towards the formulation of this paper. The Rihla, or the travelogue of Battuta, includes the details of buildings, city morphologies, trading commodities, floras and faunas, naval architecture, and the various people, local and global, he met during the course of his journey in the Indian Ocean. Now, the coastline of India has a number of micro and macroeconomic centers. These economic centers emerged as key trade centers during the medieval era and were connected to the European and Southeast Asian countries through the waterways, and they're also known as the spice route. Now, unlike the Mediterranean Sea, the Indian Ocean, if you look at the map, the Indian coastline was not a closed basin. So it allows for maximum expansive movement and trading in the southern part of the country. As a result, many principal port towns were established along the coast with feeder ports that were like small towns and villages. These collectively formed a network that allowed for movement of goods, people, wealth, and of course, there were the lower hierarchical settlement orders, from the lower hierarchical settlement orders to the higher hierarchical higher orders. Now, most of the principal port towns were cosmopolitan in nature because of their trade exchange with major port towns across the globe. Uh, uh, the strategic location of the country between Africa on one side and China on the other side would allow the trade relations between African coast, Central Asia, Middle East, Arabia, Persian Gulf, Maldives, Indonesia, Korea, Japan, China, and so on and so forth. Now, traders from the above mentioned countries settled in the port towns and eventually ended up influencing the city fabric and architecture of this space. Some notable port towns would be like Cambay, Goa, Mangalore, Coimbatore, Kollam, which would be some of the cases that I would be looking at in the paper. The port towns and cities dotted along the coastline of India were thriving with profitable training and commercial activity before the European invaders, and this is something that I would like to talks about his travel in the Indian Ocean. He talks about the richness of the cities, and in not only in terms of the wealth that they had, but also the architecture and the city planning. Since I do not have much time, so I won't go into those details. So I'd like to talk about. If you so that's Ibn Battuta's, and of course it's like an entire I would say half of the world that he had traveled, and this is just a schematic diagram that talks about his movement and particularly in the Indian Ocean. So this is so he starts from Delhi, and then when he's appointed as an ambassador to China, and he ends up at Cambay. So this Delhi word. Okay. So the journey that he takes is like he moves from Tilpat to Aligarh to Kannauj to Gwalior and Chanderi, Ujjain, and all these places to finally arrive onto to Cambay. And it's very interesting that as he keeps traveling, he meets a lot of people from Cairo, people from Ethiopia, people from Syria. They're jurists, they're slaves, they're soldiers from different parts of the world who are part of who are also now part of the place. But if you look about the city planning and architecture, so syncretic impression in the city planning and architecture techniques in the settlements en route to Cambay is evident because of these being governed or served by people of foreign origins. Some notable examples here are the city planning of Daulatabad and the remodeled town of Devagiri, which you can see here as also places that he had visited, which had Ghaznavid town planning influences. And in Bidar and Gulbarg, architecture and city layouts are evident of foreign influences, pointing towards a syncretic grammar of these towns. The architecture of Bayana Fort, Mainpuri Fort, the 52-pillar Mosque of Kannauj, the Gwalior Fort, the Narwar Fort, the Jama Masjid of Chanderi, Old City Palace in Dhar and Daulatabad are all some of the salient examples with expressions of syncretic grammar incorporated in the built vocabularies. Now, Battuta's travel in the Indian Ocean. So these are, I tried to create a map of where all the places along the edge of the coast line of along the coastline of India. You can see it's predominantly the western coast, or which we call it also as the Western Ghats, is the predominant places that he had visited. Sorry. Now, Cambay is the first one, which is Kimbaya, is located in Gujarat on the coast of Arabian Sea, was the first major port town from where Battuta embarked on his journey in the Indian Ocean. Battuta describes Cambay as a city with significant and magnificent, it's a city with magnificent architecture, manifest in mosques, mansions, and other buildings. He mentions that a majority of the inhabitants of the city were foreign merchants living in huge mansions. The impressions of the regional influence of the native places were evident in the morphological elements and architecture of the city. Battuta describes the Jama Masjid of Cambay as a large mosque with an amalgamation of various architectural styles. The architecture of the city acted as a style interface between the Sultanate dynasty of India and the countries in the Western Indian Ocean. The Jama Masjid, or the Friday Mosque, follows an Arab layout scheme with an architectural Hindu architecture. Such stylistic syncretism is strongly evident in many architectural practices along the coast of India because of the trade connections with Arabia and Southeast Asia. The mosque was built by this person from Qazroon, Shiraz in Iran, called Umar bin Ahmad, and his tomb is also located next to the mosque, which is an exemplary work of intricate decorative pattern. These decorative styles, now this is interesting that these decorative styles from Cambay traveled all the way to Sumatra, then Java, then Lar in Iran, Zofar in Oman, Aden and Zuban in Yemen, and then Mogadishu in Somalia. So it's only not that things were traveling to this part of the world. From here, it was also traveling to other parts of the world. So the architectural, the decorative styles, the city planning, they were also influencing other parts of the country, other countries of the world too. Battuta also elaborates on the presence of a house which which was Sharif al-Samari's house in Cambay as one of the great mansions of the port town, a mansion with heavier blocks of wood and an enormous gateway like that of a city. Now, the architecture of Samara in Iraq, this is from where the person is, it has features wherein the use of wood as a roofing material is evident, and that is something which is unlike the architecture that we see in the region of Gujarat or in the Western Ghats, where you see wood being predominantly used as, heavy blocks of woods being used as the roofing material. So the architecture of Samara in Iraq has features wherein the use of wood as a roofing material is evident. The Great Mosque of Samara incorporated wooden beams and timber framework to support the roof structure. There are also incidences of use of wooden roof supported by pillars and other large span structures in Samara. Now, the palatial houses were characterized by the presence of gateways. And if you try to look at how the mansions were being designed in Gujarat, they were greatly influenced by the architecture that was happening in Iraq too. And the chief merchant of Cambay was an person from Iran named Najmuddin Jilan, a wealthy man with a huge mansion who also built a mosque in the city, incorporating features of the Middle East and Arabian architectural features. Of course, there are mentions of Kavi, Gandhar, Goga, Perim. Perim is a small island that you can see on the left-hand side top, which is like the upper western coast. The central western coast, which has Goa as one of the first destinations that he came to, then Anjidiva, Honavar, Basrur, Barkur, Mangalore. Mangalore being an important key settlement over here. Something that I would like to mention about Goga here is that that's a port town that had bazaars and mosques, and it was dedicated to Khizr. The Khizr was an Arab saint. So there was a mosque that is being dedicated to an Arab saint. Now we're trying to talk about these relationships that were across the water with the countries on the other side of the Indian Ocean. The architecture of the mosque is an amalgamation of the arcuated style of the Arabs and the trabeated indigenous style of building construction. The mosque, made of the local laterite stone blocks, also shows a syncretism in the manner of the construction of the dome, wherein on the trabeated base an attempt of creating squinches. Squinches is normally you see it as part of a process that is involved in creation of the dome, can be witnessed too. And also there was a very rudimentary approach of vault construction in the mihrab of the mosque. Now in the central part, Battuta then resumes his journey from Goga and then moves to the central part of India, which is the central part of the western coast, to Goa, which there is where he finds a mosque that has a strong resemblance to a mosque in Baghdad. And then the islands of Sandabur had frequent visitors from, Sandabur is the present-day Goa. The islands of Sandabur had frequent visitors from Spain, Yemen, Persian Gulf, Arabia. They were trading in horses, trading in spices. And the strategic location of Sandabur between Cambay and Malabar, Malabar to the south and Cambay to the north of the coast to talk, proved an advantageous for the port town as it functioned as a midway stopover for vessels moving towards the Indian coastline. But between these two major commercial centers of the medieval period, thereafter, of course, he proceeds to, Anjidiv, Honavar, and other places like Fakanur, Manjanur, Hili, and Jurfatan. In Jurfatan, which is the present-day Kannur, was the next stoppage, like one of the stoppages, major stoppages of Battuta's journey in the Indian Ocean, where he met a jurist from Baghdad named al-Sarasi. The port town had trade relations with Oman, Iran, Yemen, China. And as per Wang Duan, who was another, a Chinese traveler contemporary to Ibn Battuta, the traders of Jurfatan were fond of their Chinese counterparts and often sold them at pearls at insignificant prices. That's what he mentions as. One of the most salient features of this particular town was a large tank that was referred as a bain by Battuta. And it was a big, 150,000 square meters of water tank. It had 28 red stone pavilions with 4 seats of the loggias. Now, laterite being the principal building material in the region, the use of red sandstone was probably new to the place. It might have been an import from Iran because of the rich trade relations with Central Asia, where the material is found in abundance in the Fergana Basin. So that's a material that doesn't belong to the place. So it's more like a borrowed material and a borrowed style of construction from across the Indian Ocean, predominantly Iran, where the material is found in abundance. Next to the tank, there is also a huge cathedral mosque which has a big tank for ablution and bathing. I'll also be talking about a tank and when I slightly move ahead with this. So then thereafter he moves to Calicut. Calicut is another important port town, and he describes, of course, he describes the cathedral mosque of the town, again with consisting of gazebos and loggias, and the imam of the mosque was from Oman. And so Battuta's description of it's very interesting to see how he is, he talks about it talks about the people who are traveling to this part of the world. He talks about the materials that are traveling to this part of the world. He talks about the architecture influences. He talks about the city planning inspirations, and again, of course, for the kind of trade exchange that is happening
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Yeah. So, so he then further his journey is towards the south, and then he goes to Maldives and comes back to the Indian coast. And so if you talk about summarize it in like major findings, the town planning technique of the Sassanid Empire, as well as towns in the Persian Gulf, had a very strong influence on the city layouts of the port towns, as is evident in Battuta's description of the settlements. The layout of the 4 major towns, Cambay, Calicut, Kollam, and Madurai, have a strong reflection of Sassanid town layouts. The layout of the Sassanid cities had 4 important morphological elements: the fort, the bazaar, the mosque, and the mohallas. And it's something which is like cities of Bam, Kerman, Shiraz, Tabriz, Tehran, Jarans, to talk about. There are like excellent examples of such layout. Now, all these 4 urban elements find a strong presence in the layout of the 4 important port towns that I mentioned. The fort of Cambay, the Kazruni Mosque, the vibrant bazaars, and the Shahristan, which is the city, the residential part of the city, be it in Cambay, or the elements in Calicut with the Jama Palli Mosque, the Baliangai Market, and the residential quarters. Then Kollam was defined by the presence of Thomas Fort and the Kulur Villa Juma Mosque. Then the Chinnakada Market and the residential quarters with different sub-mohallas and other features. So was with Madurai. Madurai on the east was inspired by the urban morphology of the capital of India, Tughlaqabad. The plan of Tughlaqabad was inspired by Bust in Afghanistan and Nishapur in Iran. And the 2 important Ghaznavid settlements were in the highest elevations of the site was dedicated to the construction of the city. The regional architecture was influenced by the presence of traders from different countries to a great extent. The new cosmopolitan architecture had a syncretic form, function, material, technique, concept, culture of construction. And even the naval architecture, that is, the construction of the ships, which the Chinese were very good with, had borrowed elements of cities and culture. The built influences on the regional architecture of the western coast has already been there's something that I mentioned. One important feature to note is the design typology of temples and the mosque. The presence of water tanks in the historic temples across the coastal cities is a very common feature, and this feature has been incorporated in the mosque typologies, where the water tank was used for ablution purposes. And another noteworthy feature was that the Arab features like the domes and the arcuated vocabulary was incorporated in the mosque design vocabularies, but there was an introduction of an antechamber before the main hall of the mosque, which was a borrowed feature from towns on the opposite side of the Arabian Sea, particularly Yemen. So I mean, this was like the kind of influences that I could draw of what makes these places cosmopolitan in nature, and the kind of so these were the major destinations of Ibn Battuta's journey in the Indian Ocean, along the coastline of the country, along the coastline of India, and the kind of the people and the traders that he came across, and so if you look at this map, then it shows so I've tried to talk about the places where Battuta talks about the inspirations that were being drawn from other parts of the world to these cities. Almost all the settlements had foreign traders, many of whom had built their mansions. There were foreign jurists, there were governors, soldiers, preachers, saints. There were countries with countries with strong relations. Like Calicut, if you can see that there are three. That's 9 countries that they had an influence on the architecture as well as the people. So the cosmopolitan nature of the settlements dotted along the coastal belt of India is evident in the manner of town planning, architecture, trade, commerce, and demographic composition. The exchange centers or the lower settlement orders and the mercantile settlements or the higher settlement orders both exhibit a wide range of multinational interactions that were emblematic of constructive growth of the trading nations in the Indian Ocean along the coastline, as elaborated in the work of Ibn Battuta's journey in the Indian Ocean. So I think with this I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well within time. All right. Thank you so much. We can have questions now.
Thank you, Iqtedar. That was indeed a very fascinating paper. We have a question for you from Ms. Aditi Das Khan. She says, could you please mention some details about the common residential houses during those days, where architectural materials used accessible and affordable for common local people, to apart from those notable mansions or mosques? Your response to it, please.
Yeah. So as I mentioned that laterite was the predominant material that was being used. So it is the material that is easily available in the Western Ghats. So you'd see that if the entire coastline of the country from Gujarat all the way to Tamil Nadu, you'd see that major construction material that is being used in the construction of the residences is the laterite. So I'm not talking about the construction of the mosque or the mansions that the traders who had come from different parts of the world who were building over here with their own native architectural grammar. But I'm talking about the residences here. So the materials that were being used predominantly was laterite. And also, if I talk about the styles, they were, it again depends, the Shahristan, as mentions, as the residential quarter of the city, which was the kind of, if I'm to say that the kind of language that was being the language of the vocabularies that were being used in the architecture of the place was more or less, it depends on how wealthy was a person. And then as per, depending on if the economic class, if one is to, if I can use that term, then you'd see that the kind of the elements that were being used in the residential pockets along the coastline were the moment you look at the structure, you look at the residence, you can make out that, okay, whether this is a house of a wealthy person or not, depending on, or whether this person has traveled to a different part of the world, because there were inspirations and influences that he would bring in the elements from a different part of the world, and then of course it would be part of the architecture of his house or her house now. So material being, well, if I'm to talk about the material, yes, it was laterite, and the problem with laterite definitely is that one of the major challenges was, other than of course the local craftsmanship that was available for the temples and the mosques, would be the intricate detail network, the intricate decorative patterns that would be part of the celebrated buildings into the city, which was not evident in the residential quarters. So yes, I would say it was more to do with laterite, unlike brick or any other form of material which was predominant in other parts of the country.
Thank you for your response. We have another question from Professor Dilip Menon. Says, excellent laying out of the circulation to architectural styles across the ocean. Given the cosmopolitan nature of the port cities with a multiplicity of peoples from elsewhere, pre-nation state, would the idea of foreign, which you use, mean Is this a word that even Battuta uses? Should port cities be seen less as part of a putative India, in quotes, and more as part of an Indian Ocean cosmopolis? Given the circulation of architects, masons, etc. through the ocean, couldn't the phrase be Indian Ocean architecture rather than a coastal architecture? Are the coasts part of India or contingent parts of places elsewhere? As Brodel argued for a later century, the Malabar coast was part of a world that stretched from Malacca through Aden to Venice, Lisbon, etc. See Mehraj Shukfi work, for example. Could you stand back from your paper and think about an oceanic architectural cosmopolitanism? Your response to it, yes.
Yes, Professor Menon, yeah, so of course, Shukuhi's work has, I have cited a lot of, at some places I've cited Shukuhi's work, and I think it's one of the most wonderful research that we can see of the architecture along the coastline of India is of Shukuhi's work. So I have referred to his work, and it's really very inspiring. Well, I do agree. I think it's more of we should rather call it an Indian something that I didn't I didn't think of this term as something that I could have maybe mentioned is the Indian Ocean architecture rather than the coastal architecture, because if we try to look at on the other side of the Indian Ocean too, talk about Iran or the entire Arabian Peninsula, and on the right hand side, if you try to focus on Southeast Asia, then there are a lot of these elements of architecture that were being exchanged. I won't say the entire vocabulary, but there's something that I would say are critical regionalities that we mention in architecture as critical regionalities, is that the architecture is definitely rooted at the place, but then there are these elements and there are these materials that often tend to influence. So if you try to look at the entire the coastal belt of the country, all the way to Bengal, to Gujarat, and then of course on the other side we'll have the Persian Gulf, and towards on the right hand side we have the South China Sea and the entire area. I think that we can definitely, I think, rather call it an Indian Ocean cosmopolis than just calling it an exclusive coastal architecture of the country. Here I was trying to understand how Battuta, because Battuta isn't, so the question, given the cosmopolitan nature of with a multiplicity of peoples from elsewhere, what would the idea of foreign which you use mean? So the foreign is majorly, so Battuta is trying to talk about the various kind, the people who are coming from different parts of the world to this, to the Indian coastline, is what he refers as also mentioning as, okay, he came from this part of the world and this part of the world and this part of the world. So that's where, so I'm trying to use that word in the same context as Battuta was trying to elaborate. But I think it would be an interesting dimension to now even explore for us as architects, to talk about a new vocabulary of architecture that could be the Indian Ocean architecture, rather than focusing on just the exclusive, talking about exclusively at the coastline architecture of India. So yes, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your response. We have another question from Geena Soini Chittaji. Apologies if I'm pronouncing it wrongly. The question is, does Battuta write about the architecture along the East African coast in any of his papers? I'm wondering whether you plan to expand your study to examine the Swahili coast too. Your response, please.
Yes, I think he does mention, he does mention places like Somalia, and but I won't say he didn't go into those details. I have to, I haven't gone through the other volumes in great detail, but because I was particularly focusing on on his journeys in India, from the time, of course, when Muhammad bin Tughlaq was the king of India at that time. So no, I haven't looked at that aspect, and I think it would be interesting. So I was also wondering when I was writing the paper, I was also wondering it would be interesting to even, he mentions the Mediterranean, he mentions the Persian Gulf, he mentions the South China Sea. So it would be interesting to also, because when he was also trying to draw comparison between the places. So it would be interesting to actually go to those places rather through Battuta and also through others who are contemporary to Battuta and try to draw similarities between the places. So I think that would be interesting. Thank you so much for this suggestion.
Thank you for your response. So we have another observation. This is from Stephen. He says, that was a very investigating journey of cosmopolitanism. If we think of a mainstream idea of a Gujarati and a Malayali or Tamilian, they look two extremely different cultures and communities. This kind of an imagination is very much in the popular culture. However, there is so much more the coastline spaces share with each other. One of the examples is the connection you drawn between architecture and coastlines through the travels of Ibn Battuta. This opens up spaces for imagination of shared histories and worlds, which are more connected rather than disassociated. Thanks for the intriguing and interesting Battutain connection, taking the liberty to give a coinage. If you'd like to say anything.
But then connection, well, yeah, I like the word. Maybe, yeah, we can think about it. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, we can't look at particularly, I should say, countries that share oceans, countries that share the common water space. That I do not, I think we cannot look at them as individual regions, but rather we should look at them as one collective region where if I'll speak as an architect because it's more of the exchange that is so evident and it's interesting to look at regionalities, the response to regionalities, but also at the same time the relation that it draws from other places. So yeah, thank you so much.
There's someone, there's no name. Someone wants to ask a question. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, 1 minute.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Nilima Jayachandran, and it's well past 2 p.m. here in central Pennsylvania. So I'm not in a mental space to write in. So I'll rather ask my question. So I could only hear half of your talk, but I'm someone interested in materialities of the Indian Ocean, both, South Asia, as well as the Swahili coast, and particularly interested in aestheticism, right? And surface designs. What I want to ask you is, from the journals of Ibn Battuta, was there any recurring notes that he made of recurring designs or recurring Indian Ocean aestheticism that is then kind of, rechanneled and rendered through these architectural spaces? So what is uniquely Indian Ocean or coastal about this, other than the arches or certain kind of design features that a sailor or anybody who's circulating in the Indian Ocean would feel comfortable the moment they enter these spaces?
Yeah, okay. Something that Ibn Battuta, I mean, if I look at the translated works of Ibn Battuta, then this is something that doesn't come out so strongly. But if I'm to talk about not only as architecture, but as the architectural landscape, so not looking at as
within a minute, please. Within a minute, please.
Yes, so I'm not looking at architecture as an individual component, but the architectural landscape. So it's not only about the features or the elements of an individual structure, but it's also about the kind of proportion systems that were being followed. So which is something very, very unique. If I have to talk about the coastline, the settlements in the coastline, because they were not just trying to imitate, or rather, I won't say imitate, but rather inspire from the elements from the different countries that people were, of course, coming, the traders, or the kind of exchange that they had. But it was also about this collective impression, the collective impression of how the entire architectural landscape is to be. What would be the proportions of the buildings? How far will it be from the coast? What would be the depth of the structure? And exactly what if you talk about what would be the space between the buildings? What would be the height of the building? So this entire, it's a collective impression, which I felt would be an interesting if one tries to illustrate through Battuta's explanation, through travelogues, taking his travelogues as a medium. If one tries to illustrate the overall cityscape, then there would be a very interesting, which again is a collective impression that you'll find of, which is an inspiration again being drawn from other parts of the world rather than being exclusively part of the place.
Thank you so much.
We try to, okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. There are no more questions. I believe we can wrap up today's stimulating session. Over to you, Grace.
Yeah, we have one more speaker, Shameem. Shameem is here with us.
He's arrived?
Yes, he has.
All right, so we can request Shameem to go ahead with his presentation. He is a PhD scholar at the School of Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I request him to present his paper, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all. I'm sorry that there was some technical glitches in joining the meeting. I hope I'm audible to all of you.
You are.
Yes, okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. The title of my paper is Ulamā Networks Across the Seas, Understanding the Trajectory of Islam in Medieval Malabar. Precisely, the attempt in this paper is to show that the 16th century had witnessed an unprecedented development in the Islamic history of Malabar. That was the compilation or production of several fatwa and jurisprudence texts as a result of the trans-oceanic networks and entanglements of local ulama or Islamic scholars. And I discussed some of these, some of the main issues dealt with in this text to give you an idea of how local scholars try to address the legalistic aspects of everyday Muslim life in Malabar. The paper is divided into two parts. In the first part, I briefly discuss certain aspects of ulama networks in Malabar during the pre-16th century phase. And the second part, in the second section is a detailed discussion on the trans-oceanic networks of local ulama in Malabar and the production of fatwa and legal texts. Well, to begin with the pre-16th century phase in the history of the Islamic community in Malabar, owing to the existing trans-oceanic commercial networks and circulations, they had emerged on most port cities of the Malabar coast, at least by the late 13th century. Muslim settlements sizable enough to have masjid Jamia or congregational mosque and religious offices such as imam, that is leader of mosque, leader of prayer, khatibs or preachers, and qadis who were judges. And these settlements, by the course of time, grew in size as the West Asian Muslim merchants attracted converts and progenies from among the local population who were to be known later as Mapilas. Although these local Muslims soon outnumbered foreign elements in the Muslim settlements of Malabar, I argue that it was the foreigners or who were also known as Paradesis who kept on managing and controlling the religious affairs and institutions of these settlements. What this implied was that foreign ulama or theologians were preferred by the Paradesis to serve in various capacities like qadis, imams, muftis, etc. These foreign ulama had the privilege of being taught by the stalwarts of the Islamic heartlands, of being familiar with the important Islamic literature, and of course knowing Arabic language in a good manner. And thus were entrusted by the Paradesi merchant communities, merchant members, to administer Islamic Sharia in the Muslim settlements of Malabar. And the result was that the Islamic religious offices in Malabar came to be dominated by these foreign ulama. Here I further argue that since these foreign ulama were attracted to Malabar mainly because of the Paradesi merchants, they were rarely connected to the local members of the community, and so were usually not confronted with queries and conundrums arising out of Mapilas or local Muslims' encounter with the local cultures and realities of Malabar. Besides, the language barriers also added to the communication gap between foreign ulama and the Mapilas, thereby depriving the former of the opportunity to deliberate on Islamic legal issues arising out of the latter's everyday life and practices. This explains why there was almost zero literary contribution to the field of Islamic law and jurisprudence in Malabar during the pre-16th century phase, despite the presence there of so many Islamic foreign scholars and savants from training from the learning centers of West Asia. In fact, as I further discuss in the following discussion, in the following section, it was the queries and conundrums raised by the local Muslims which would form a major trigger for the formation of trans-oceanic ulama networks and for the birth of several fatwa texts during the 16th century in Malabar. Now coming to the 16th century phase, which is the second part of this paper, as the existing historiography has already shown, after the entry of the Portuguese into the Indian Ocean arena and their attempt at monopolizing its seaborne trade, especially that of spices, with diverse control mechanisms, the Paradesi Muslim merchants of Malabar had to leave its port cities and to relocate to safer ports around the ocean by the early decades of the 16th century. With the advent of the Portuguese, it was not just the Paradesi merchants who left Malabar, but also that they were accompanied by foreign Islamic scholars who had been serving the Muslim settlements in Malabar under the patronage mainly of these Paradesi merchants. This retreat in turn left a vacuum in the religious leadership of Muslims and the administration of Islamic Sharia in Malabar. This vacuum, however, was not remained unfilled, as I argue. There was an ascendancy of the indigenous scholarly class who would soon appear to hold the positions of khatibs, qazis, muftis, etc., and involved in the customization and administration of Islamic law in the Muslim quarters of Malabar during the 16th century. By the indigenous scholars, I mean not just members of the Mapila Muslim community per se, but also those of Arab origin whose generations of ancestors had been living in Malabar and thus were assimilated to the local Islamic community. A typical example of this category of scholars, Islamic scholars in Malabar, were the members of the Makhtoum family, to which belonged Ahmad Zainuddin, who is otherwise pretty known as the author of Tuhfatul Mujahideen, the historical account, and who figures prominently in the following discussion. Unlike the erstwhile foreign scholars, the indigenous ulama of Malabar were well connected to the Mapila Muslims and their everyday lives, and so were frequently confronted with queries and conundrums pertaining to the Islamic legal aspects. This in turn prompted the local ulama to consult the stalwarts and giants of West Asia and seek their legal opinions, resulting ultimately in the appearance of, in Malabar, of several fatwa collections. We see that at times multiple questions were raised to one single scholar in West Asia, and then compiling the legal opinions given by that scholar, a fatwa text was produced. On the other hand, on other occasions, same question was raised to multiple savants, and then compiling their answers, a fatwa text was produced. Here on the screen, I will introduce to some of the fatwa collections of these sorts that have survived to us. Well, this first one is first and most important one is al-Ajiba. Al-Ajiba. Before I begin to talk about these things, most of these collections, manuscripts are unpublished and even untitled manuscripts of fatwa collections, which are yet to be published and which have been kept in personal, informal repositories in multiple locations of Malabar. So this first one is Al-Ajiba Anil As'ila Al-Ghariba, which is a collection of fatwas or legal opinions given by multiple scholars of West Asia to the questions raised by Ahmad Zainuddin Makhtoom during the 16th century. And the second one is, this is an untitled fatwa collection by Ahmad Zainuddin. Again, Ahmad Zainuddin compiling the legal opinions given by the Meccan jurist Abdurrauf al-Waiz al-Makki. What I have given is the first and last page of these collections. These are in fact of multiple pages. Then this third one is Al-Fatawa Az-Zabidiyya Anil As'ila Al-Kalikutiyya. This is an anonymous fatwa collection compiling the legal opinions of the Yemeni scholar Abdurrahman ibn Ziyad to the questions that were raised from Calicut. The next one is an untitled fatwa compiling the legal opinions of the Yemeni jurist Abdullah ibn Umar Bamakhrumah. And finally, this is also an untitled fatwa collection compiling the responses given by the Meccan jurist Ibn Hajar al-Haytami. I'll come back to the discussion. So a perusal of these collections, these fatwa texts, reveal certain things. First, the local ulama in Malabar used to seek legal opinions of the savants of West Asia, either by personally visiting them, especially on occasions of their Hajj pilgrimage to Hijaz. In fact, in fatwa collections, we find passing references to occasions when Malabar's ulama were in Hijaz during the Hajj seasons and were involved in scholarly interactions with the West Asian stalwarts. When they could not personally visit the savants of West Asia, the local ulama in Malabar used to send correspondences to them with the help of merchants and pilgrims visiting Hijaz, Yemen, etc., who then would bring back their legal opinions. Another thing that appears from the fatwa literature is that some of the ulama in Malabar, like Ahmad Zainuddin Makhtoom, had in fact gone to the Islamic heartlands for higher studies after the completion of their basic studies in Malabar, and then spent several years there studying under the pupillage or training of several doyens of Shafi'ite school, such as Ibn Hajar al-Haytami and Abdurrahman ibn Ziyad. And it was the exposure that they received there and the connections they made during these years of their learning in overseas lands, which would in future help the local ulama in forging intellectual networks with the scholars of West Asia and seek their legal opinions. Here arises an important question. Why did the local ulama in 16th century Malabar try to look for religious rulings or opinions from West Asian scholars? Wasn't their higher studies from the heartlands of Islam an indicator of their merit enough to make their own fatwas acceptable to the general Muslim populace of Malabar? The answers to this question has to be sought in local ulama's concern over the credibility factor. Unlike erstwhile foreign ulama hailing from the Islamic heartlands, the indigenous scholars did not appear to have enjoyed much credibility in the eyes of the general Muslim populace in Malabar. Therefore, it was in their attempt to offer more credible legal opinions and rulings that scholars like Ahmad strove to seek fatwas of savants from Mecca, Yemen, etc.
5 minutes. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. To illustrate, I would call your attention to a fatwa case involving Ahmad himself. in his Al-Ajiba, Ahmad speaks about the legal opinions he gathered from the servants of West Asia regarding the separation case of an Arab woman in question. This woman had come to question in the mid-16th century along with her Arab husband, and had later married two other persons, including a local theologian of the port city, after she had been estranged from her Arab husband. The complexity of her case had puzzled the Muslims of Persian, and Ahmad was one of the first jurists to be consulted by them on the legal validity of her marriages to all of those who consulted him. And when the same was spread among the people, many of them refused to accept his ruling, though some others agreed with him. It was at this juncture that Ahmad decided to seek the legal opinions of his teachers as well as contemporary luminaries from West Asia on the matter. We are told that he received written fatwas from his teachers like Ibn Hajar Haythami, besides personally visiting around a dozen of luminaries of West Asia and collecting their legal opinions. All of these luminaries gave him fatwas which were more or less endorsing his own fatwa. What turns out from the whole trajectory of this fatwa case is how concerned local Islamic scholars were about the credibility factor. They appear to have felt that Muslim believers in Malabar were more likely to be convinced if they were provided with religious rulings offered by or vindicated by Islamic scholars from West Asia. Now, what were the issues that scholars like Ahmad discussed with the overseas scholars? One can see that a wide range of issues were deliberated on this through these intellectual interactions, which including that of life, etc. One of the major issues that investigators in many of the questions was that of
Shameem, maybe you can switch off your video. Your audio is cracking. Right?
Shut off your video, keep your audio on.
You can keep your audio on and you can maybe switch off the video. Your audio is crackling.
Have we lost Shameem?
No, he's still there. I mean, he just said that. It seems we have lost him. Shameem, are you there?
Were you able to connect with him on phone?
Yes. He says that it's not loading.
Oh, then his income is off.
Shameem?
He seems to be speaking. I can hear like low voices.
Sorry.
Maybe you can call him up on the mobile phone and then you can use your own speaker and he can speak on the mobile and that's how you can relay his. Oh, he's there.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. Back. There was again some issue with my laptop and it got disconnected. So I think it's already out of time.
So maybe you could go on to
anyway, to invite my discussion. So one of the major issues that was dealt with in this through this intellectual interactions processes was kind of customs duties that was repeated along the areas of Malabar. So scholars like Ahmad asked the scholars whether these customs duties levied along the coast areas of Malabar amount the so-called marks tax was Islamic Sharia, and those parties and were involved in the election from the Muslims and were sharing all were buying shares of these activities from justice of Zamaris and other in Malabar. They were doing something anti-Islamic. And the scholars responded to that these customs duties which were levied along the coast areas amount to as so they should receive or be involved in the collection of these as.
Not able to hear you actually. It's not.
Shameem, just switch off the video and speak through the audio.
Okay, fine.
Hello, are you there?
Hello?
Yeah, now it's perfectly all right. Yeah, go on.
Okay, thank you. So such fatwas invalidating the customs duties or marks levied along the coastal areas of Malabar, when those fatwas spread among the Muslim populace, there was tendencies of tax evasion among them. We find that in one of the fatwas, Ahmad Zainuddin asked about one Muslim merchant who came to the port city of in Malabar, in one of the port cities in Malabar, and he came along with all his merchandise or goods, but he was hiding those goods from the sight of the port officials or customs officials. And Ahmad asked whether he was allowed to swear by Quran that he did not carry anything, or if that was not allowed, was he allowed to swear by the local method of swearing, that was dipping hands in boiling water, in boiling oil. So he was asking whether he was allowed to do that to preserve, to safeguard his wealth. So the Egyptian scholar, the Egyptian jurist Mohammed responded that the merchants could do that. He could swear either by Quran or by the local method of swearing, because the safety of his goods was dependent on such a swearing. So that was another issue that was deliberated on these intellectual interactions. And another issue was that of booties or war or ghanima, which was called in Arabic as ghanima or war booties, the booties or swags from naval warfare. So scholars asked whether the booties that were collected from the naval encounters, we all know that the Portuguese, after the advent of the Portuguese, Muslims in Malabar were in confrontation with the Portuguese, and they often were involved in privateering or piracy, and with the support of course, the Zamarins of Calcutta. And the extent of their piracy went to the extent that they even started piracying or attacking their own community members and other merchants, Portuguese as well as other other Asian merchants like Gujaratis. So the scholars like Ahmad asked whether the booty collected from these naval encounters amounted to the ghanima, which according to Islamic Sharia had to be distributed among the deserving people, including for the preservation of frontiers, etc., etc. Or could that be collected? Could that be taken by the members who were involved in these fightings? So here we find that scholars like Ahmad were in fact, they were in favor of all these naval encounters, but they were skeptic about the way these booties were distributed among the members. Another issue, finally, I'll come to the conclusion. The final issue which I'm going to discuss is about the hijrah. Scholars like Ahmad asked West Asian savants whether Muslims of Malabar were to migrate or to undertake the so-called hijrah, or a holy pilgrimage to polities under Islamic rule, because in Malabar they were not allowed to to practice Islam in ways similar to their counterparts in other parts of Islamic countries. They raised issues like they were not allowed to slaughter cows in Malabar because that were venerated by the non-Muslims in Malabar. They were not able to implement Islamic Sharia in Islamic penal system in Malabar. So all these sort of issues were raised to the Islamic scholars there in West Asia, and they responded that they had not required to migrate to Islamic countries, because if they were allowed to if they were allowed to practice their Islam overtly or in public, they had not to leave. They had not to migrate to other Islamic parts of the world. So that's coming to the conclusion. I would say that unpacking more and more of such fatwa and jurisprudence texts from Malabar and other Indian Ocean littoral spaces can significantly enhance our understanding of the transoceanic entanglements of medieval times, and of how contemporary Islamic scholars on the littoral spaces of the Indian Ocean try to address the legalistic issues arising out of Muslims' encounter with new socio-political settings. With this, I will end my discussion, and sorry for all the interruptions and technical issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Shameem. I have a comment here from Professor Dilip Menon.
Okay,
he's writing, you see, the Portuguese ejection of Muslim scholars from elsewhere on the Malabar coast is creating a tradition of local scholarship. This is an interesting argument since it talks about the disruption and creativity at the same time. Is there a distinction between pre-16th century text and post-16th century text in terms of their universe of references? Are there texts emerging in Arabic Malayalam at this point? How does your work relate to Ronit Ricky's idea of Arab cosmopolis? Are there any fatwas about presence of matrilineal among Mappilas, which was an aberration from West Asia, considering the argument you make that local scholarship was in thrall to the West Asian scholars?
Yes.
Would you respond to that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, first I need to say that during the pre-16th century phase in Malabar, we hardly find any legal text, any fatwa or jurisprudence text being produced in Malabar. It was that was in fact the crux of my argument. It was during the 16th century that we find these sort of fatwa legal texts being produced. And the reason for that was that during the pre-16th century, the local Ulamā who served the Muslim settlements in Malabar were all foreigners who were less connected with the local members of the Islamic community in Malabar.
But during the 16th century, after the retreat of Pardesi or foreign merchants, along with foreign scholars, there was an ascendancy of these local Islamic scholars, Ulamā, who were well connected to the Muslim populace, general Muslim populace or Mapilas in Malabar, and thus were often confronted with queries related to their everyday Muslim practices, lives. And that's where we find that when these Mapilas consulted these local ulama with multiple questions, then the scholars were forced to consult the savants of Islamic heartlands in West Asia. That's where we find the production of fatwa collections and legal texts. I hope I answered your question.
Right. Thank you. We have a comment from the Department of English. Is this Stephen, I guess?
Yes.
He has questions, sorry. So he has two questions. Whether alimas in Malabar during the 16th century as scholars or intellectuals, long before the Muslims settled in northern India, there were colonies in southern India, Mapila being one of the first Muslim community in the region. It is well known that even before the advent of Islam, the Arabs had trade relations with the Malabar coast. From the ancient times, Kerala has imported dates from the port of Basra in Iraq, a practice that has even contributed to the proverb to Malayalam Ningal. Excuse me, I cannot pronounce that. You should not export dates to Basra. So, do you situate your arguments in the specifics of medieval transoceanic or transoceanic relevance of the Malabar region? I am asking this to know about the centrality of jurisprudence in your arguments.
Yes. Of course, the existing transoceanic connections that prevailed even before the advent of Islam into the Indian Ocean area, that in fact helped all these scholars during the 16th century to forge intellectual connections with West Asian savants. We know that these scholars or even people who used to embark on pilgrimage, they used to travel by the same route, by the same networks which were used otherwise by the merchants. So the existing transoceanic commercial networks, routes, etc., were very much helpful for these scholars to forge their own connections. They went to the West Asian lands for higher studies in Islamic sciences through the same networks, through the same routes that were used by the merchants. So, of course, the existing preceding transoceanic commercial networks, of course, were helpful for these Islamic scholars to forge their own intellectual connections during the 16th century.
Thank you. This is my
and Shameem, just a second, Aditi.
Yes.
And Shameem, what about the alimas? Were there alimas in the 16th century, the female intellectuals of the Islamic jurisprudence?
I could not find anywhere any. Yes. I could not find anywhere any reference to alimas or female scholars. Although we know from Ibn Battuta's account that in Mangalore, which was in medieval times part of the Malabar coast, there was training for both girls and boys in Islamic sciences, especially in the studies of Quran, etc. But I could not find any prominent figure from among the women as scholars or alimas.
Okay, I think Professor Dilip Menon has something more to say. He's writing, you see the was in thrall. Where do I think I read out, Grace, did I not read out the entire question? I'm sorry.
You did, yes.
I did. Okay.
He answered only the first part.
I think I did. This was my curiosity. If we have some more time, maybe you could answer this. Could you talk about the intricacies of interaction between the theological Arabic with the local language? Like what kind of implications did it have on local understanding of Islam? For instance, semantic range of words, they often change when translated to other language.
I'm sorry. Can you please elaborate on the question?
Yeah. I'm asking if you could talk about the intricacies of interaction between Quranic Arabic with local language. Like, do you have any example which talks about how the understanding of Islam changed with a word being translated from Arabic to any local language?
What I can say at this juncture is that we find in this fatwa literature issues like when rituals, Islamic rituals, which were to be practiced, which were to be read in Arabic language, when Mapilas or local Muslims in Malabar tried to read them in their own language, that was Malayalam language, then the scholars try to address this issue, whether they were allowed to say these rituals in local language, like the phrases that had to be read during the nikah ceremony or during the marriage ceremony or during the occasions of purchasing something which in fact had to be read in Arabic language, but local Muslims were reading them in their own language. So local scholars try to address these sort of issues, whether these things had to be practiced in Arabic itself, or could they do that in their own local languages. So of course there were concerns, the scholars were concerned about these things. And I think I missed Professor Menon's question on Arabic Malayalam legal text.
I think that you missed this idea of matrilineal related fatwa. Could you elaborate on that once again?
Yes. There was one question on Arabic Malayalam legal text. I could not find any Arabic Malayalam text during the 16th century, although I have in my possession some more fatwas other than the ones I have shown here. But I could not find anything in local Arabic Malayalam language or script. But within the Arabic text, I could find Malayalam terms being in use, like scholars like Ahmad have cited the Malayalam terminologies used by Mapilas in Malabar in say, for example, in marriage ceremony. Other than that, I could not find fatwa collections or texts in Arabic Malayalam. Even the local scholars, when they interacted within the Malabar with other scholars, even at that time they used Arabic language rather than Arabic Malayalam. And the question on matrilineal among Mapilas, since this was an elaboration of West I could not find anything on this matrilineal issue. Although scholars like Ahmad, we know from his historical account of Fatul Mujahideen that he was against this practice of matrilineal system. He in fact complains about the practice of Muslims in port cities like Kannanur in northern Kerala, in northern Malabar. But I could not find him raising this issue with the scholars in West Asia.
Right. Thank you, Shameem. Thank you for that really stimulating paper. I now hand it over back to Professor Samina Hassan.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah, so we come to the end of this session, and we had a very fruitful session, and the variety of topics and the areas from literary to the architecture to Muhaddis, the Hadith studies, and all including Sufi and Ulamā and the coastal redefinitions, and also the interesting Battutian idea coming out of that. I think we had a very nice session, and also the questions were very interactive and very insightful. And I'm sure all of us benefited from this interaction today, and hoping to have more areas. And I myself was quite surprised by these new ideas that have come out of this. And from my field of study also, I have picked a few ideas from here. And we had a very fruitful session. So I think we close and then we meet again at 2, or is...
At 3. At 3:30.
3. All right.
3:30.
3:30. All right. Yeah. So I think thank you so much.
So we break for lunch and we meet after 2 hours and 30 minutes.